In my reading of philosophical theology, my understanding is that there's quite a few people who doubt that God has middle knowledge.
Yes.
And I'm aware of the scripture in favor of that doctrine, but in light of the scriptures that you just went over, why is there this doubt that God has middle knowledge if God is omniscient? It seems like it would be a necessary component of omniscience.
All right, let's talk about this, because I didn't actually read any verses as proof texts of what's called middle knowledge. Middle knowledge, or in the Latin, actually, scientia goes first. Let me redo this. Scientia media. Scientia media is a type of knowledge which is called middle knowledge. Middle knowledge is scientia media. And it was a theory developed especially by a Jesuit counter-reformer named Luis Molina. And what scientia media holds is that God not only knows everything that could happen, he not only knows all the possibilities, he not only knows everything that will happen, all the things that will take place, but he also knows everything that would happen under other circumstances. So this is a very different kind of knowledge than foreknowledge. This is not knowledge of the future. The things that God knows by a middle knowledge may never come to pass. It is knowledge, if I can use this terminology, of subjunctive conditionals, subjunctive conditional statements. A subjunctive conditional is an if-then statement in the subjunctive mood. Now, we don't, as native English speakers, do a very good job of using the subjunctive mood. Most of us probably have no idea what it is if we remember it from our high school English classes. But the subjunctive mood is a mood that is used to express contrary to fact situations, like, if I were rich, I would buy a Mercedes. I'm not rich, and I haven't bought and will not buy a Mercedes, but a subjunctive conditional would say, in the subjunctive mood, if I were rich, then I would buy a Mercedes, for example. And these subjunctive conditionals are very, very different from indicative conditionals. Indicative conditionals are conditionals in the ordinary indicative mood. And here's a wonderful example to illustrate the contrast. Consider the indicative conditional. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did. I'm sure every one of us would agree with the truth of that indicative conditional, because we all know Kennedy was assassinated. So if Oswald didn't shoot him, somebody did. So that indicative conditional is clearly true. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did. But now consider the subjunctive conditional. If Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, somebody else would have. Is that true? Well, that's not at all obviously true, unless you are a conspiracy theorist who think there was another gunman on the green knoll or something of that sort. I think most of us would say that conditional is not true, that if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, somebody else would have. So you can see there's a huge difference between these subjunctive conditionals and indicative conditionals. And the theory of middle knowledge is that God knows the truth of all of these subjunctive conditionals. Like, if Mike had been the Roman prefect of first century Palestine, he would have sent Jesus to the cross. He would have done what Pilate did. Or if you had been in ancient Israel, you would have been a Jewish monotheist. Those are the sorts of things that God is said to know by means of his middle knowledge. And as indicated, the subject of God's middle knowledge is a subject of huge controversy among theologians, because although it's fairly easy to provide proof texts of God's foreknowledge, that is, his knowledge of what will happen, it's not quite so easy to provide proof texts that God has middle knowledge. One of the Molinists' famous proof texts is the story in the Old Testament when David is fleeing from King Saul, and he goes down to a town, a city called Keilah, and he ensconces himself at Keilah. And they have there a kind of divining instrument called an ephod, which they could use to foretell the future. And so David has the priest there use the ephod to answer the question, if I remain in Keilah, will Saul come down to attack? And the ephod says, yes, Saul will come down and attack. So David asks then the next question, if Saul comes down to attack, will the men of Keilah turn me over to Saul? And the ephod says, yes, the men of Keilah will turn you over to Saul. Whereupon David flees the city so that Saul doesn't come down and the men of Keilah don't turn him over. Now, what the Molinists pointed out was clearly the ephod was not giving him foreknowledge of the future. It wasn't telling him what will happen, because we know those things didn't happen. Saul didn't attack the city. David didn't stay there, and the men of Keilah didn't turn him over. Rather, what it was giving him was knowledge of these subjunctive conditionals. If you were to remain in Keilah, Saul would attack the city. If Saul were to attack the city, the men of Keilah would turn you over to him. And so knowing that, then David flees. But this was one of the proof texts that Molinists would use to show that God, in fact, does have middle knowledge. Now, we'll talk about this later, but at this point, I simply hadn't thought to bring it up because it is so controversial, but we'll talk about it some more later on as to whether God has this kind of knowledge. Let me just say this. I think that it's difficult through these kinds of stories to prove that God has middle knowledge because the doctrine of middle knowledge requires that God has this sort of knowledge logically prior to his decision to create any world. That he uses this middle knowledge to create a certain world. And these stories are about what's going on in this world rather than God's status logically prior to his decision to create a world. So even Reformed theologians and other theologians would agree that God has knowledge of these subjunctive conditionals. That, until modern times, it really wasn't a matter of controversy whether God had knowledge of subjunctive conditionals. Of course he did. Everyone agreed that he did. The dispute was, when does he have this knowledge? Does he have it prior to his decision to create a world, or does he have it only after his decision to create a world? And that question is one for theological reflection. It's not one that you can just proof text, I think. So for that reason, I haven't brought it up, but now we have had a fairly nice discussion as a result of your question of what middle knowledge is, how it goes beyond even foreknowledge, and what scriptural warrant has usually been given for it.